instance, why do we have carpets in certain sections of a shopping center, and why do we have high traffic tiles in most areas in a shopping center? And the reason is simple. It's just because it's supposed to last us at least 12 years. So a shopping center typically in Australia designed for about 12-15 years before it needs to be revamped. Now, shopping center, any kind of infrastructure is basically just a product, so you can actually relate that to any type of other project or product that you can buy. For instance, sports shoes. You'll see that sports shoes is on the market for about 6 months before they'll change a small design issue and they'll reintroduce it as an uprated model. Same with motor vehicles. Alright, so if you buy a BMW 330i today, in about 6 months from now or a year or so, they'll change the position of the indicator light on the side of the car just so that they've got a new model and they can say this is now the facelift and sell more products. And it's basically the same. Right, so think about these construction project phases that you have over there, and let me know if you guys in your company use the same types of phases. So looking at the construction industry in Australia, if we just look at these values, this is at the end of March. These are the figures from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and you'll see there that construction, it's a sizable contribution that is made by the industry. Alright, so you can see there it's slightly up. The adjusted estimates for the work done, or the value of the work done for the total of construction in the country, it is slightly up from the previous quarter. Alright, so there is a little bit of movement in the market. Some sectors, non-residential building for instance, has gone down. So those are the interesting ones, and you'll see there's the big one, engineering. Alright, so typically everything that's lumped in there, basically mining, infrastructure development, dams, roads, that type of project would go in there. So you can see there's a growth in that, steady upwards, and this obviously coincides with the mining boom. What we have to keep in mind is, of course, we're coming towards the end of the year, and what's the global financial economy going to do with what's happening in Europe? Right, so Europe's slowing down a little bit, and we can see there's a little bit of problems with their finances there. So if we look at the participants in the procurement process, basically for each of these projects that we have, there's going to be an employer or a client, and the employer or client, he might bring along his own set of people that's going to work with him. So he might have and sometimes these guys over here, they're referred to as the professional team. Alright, so the professional team is typically the designer or the architect plus the engineer, the civil, mechanical, electrical engineers. All of those guys are lumped together into a professional team. In some cases, if you deal with different types of contract, for instance management contracts or NEC or FIDIC, you'll see that specific notice is mentioned of the project manager, for instance, and a supervisor. Alright, so these supervisor in the old days used to be the clerk of works, and he used to go around, make sure that the quality issues are always addressed. The project manager ultimately responsible for the execution of that specific project. Now if we think about professional services contractors, these engineers and architects, what do they do for us? Do they actually give us something? What they do give us is plans, everything that's on paper, so they don't really do any work on site for us, so that's why we use professional services contracts. And there's a few questions that you have to ask when you decide what type of contract strategy you're going to follow with these guys, and we'll come to those questions just now. When we look at contractors and subcontractors, once again, different ways of dealing with them. There's short contracts, there's low value contracts, different payment schemes, different strategies, lump sum, bill of quantities, activity schedule type contracts. All of those types of contracts depends on what we want to achieve at the end of the day, what's the scope for our project, and if it's going to be a big or a small project, what's the timeline, many issues that we have to think about. Suppliers, once again, also a few questions. Are they only going to supply? Is it going to be supply for and on behalf of? Can we use a simple purchase order, or is the contractor actually going to supply the material or the goods that we need to install? Alright, so that includes the equipment and the plant that goes into a building. And you also have to ask yourself, what's the difference between equipment and plant? Right, and there you have to be careful if you deal with the contracts that's in the Middle East, for instance, the NEC and FIDIC and JBCC, those types of contract. Plant is considered everything that is going to be permanently part of the building. Right, so remember that plant, permanent part of the building, all the P's. But however, if you deal with in the US and Australia, you have to specifically go and check in the contract because there are different take-ups on that, specifically when we deal with the Australian standard contract. Alright, and then of course the partner alliance partnerships, and then strategic projects. Why would we enter into a strategic project? Typically towards this time in the economy when there's a slight slump, we'll see the on the increase these strategic projects. And the reason for that is we'll see these companies entering into strategic agreements with employers or other companies just to keep their laborers or their employees busy. Right, so and that's a way of just turning it over, not making profit on it, but just keeping the staff, turning it over, and of course trying to keep the company going. All right, and then the characteristics of capital projects that we have to think about. What is the finance strategy that we have? Is it going to be self-finance? Is it going to be financed by business venture? Is it going to be financed by angels, business finance angels? Where is the funding going to come from? And typically in large large projects, infrastructure projects, there's some federal funding that comes to play. All right, the contracting strategy, we'll talk about that some more later on. Basically the engineer, procure and construct, or the EPCM, which is engineer, procure for and on behalf of, and construction management. Those are the two big ones that's in the market at the moment. And as I said previously, with project management companies taking or on the uptake in the industry, we'll see more and more of the EPCM type of projects in Australia. Alright, so the project size and project complexity, those also play a role. So the question that you have to ask is, will you rather build a $500 million gas to liquid plant as opposed to a $500 million golf estate development? Alright, so even though these projects are exactly the same value or size in value, the complexity of the projects will be different. Right? So it's obviously going to be much more difficult to construct a gas to liquid plant in Australia as opposed to a golf estate, even though the values are exactly the same. Alright, and then of course we spoke about the greenfield projects. This is a project that's brand new, brownfields, that's the one that's there's existing infrastructure that we have to work on. More difficult, lots of interfaces, much more management. And the same with a revamp. Revamp basically falls back into a brownfields project effectively. Alright, so we have to classify the risk that we're going to focus on. And this is where we say, alright, what happens if a high profile project fail? Alright, so what is a high profile project? And basically these are the projects that's typically viewed by the public on a day-to-day basis. Alright, so it's really a strategic project. The public has access to it. They can see where it's going. There's lots and lots of benefits for the community if it's successful. If it falls over, obviously everybody is unhappy about it and some heads have to roll. Alright, and then of course strategic projects, if we do projects just to get things going, and we'll see a lot of the government projects in this instance is a not-for-profit type instance. These would be classified as strategic projects. Parks, roads, bridges, dams, anything like that would be classified as a strategic project. We have to think about what's the short-term impact. If it's a big company, let's say it's a high-profile project, what is the effect going to be on the share price? Immediately there's going to be an influence on the stock market, and of course the long-term impact we also have to think about. What's going to happen later on downstream? Are we going to be able to recoup the losses that we've made, or are we going to be able to get some more jobs later on as the time goes on? And then of course also the non-financial impact of these projects that fail. Alright, so really important to take care of those. Alright, so the high risk projects, just a few ones that I want to talk about there. That project that's called just a small project. Alright, there's no such thing as just a small project. For each project you have to go through the administrative load. These most probably, if you're in your company, there's a stage gate approach that you have to go through, lots and lots of documentation, and each of these actions take a lot of time. And the moment you start cutting corners, that's where that project will fall over. Right, so one-man projects, there's also nothing like that. And then the question that I want to leave you guys with for a while is, how many projects can a project manager really manage? Right, so if you really think about it, when do you start losing control? Now, in many companies that I've worked for, that I've consulted for in the past, have their project managers sitting at 18, 19, 20 projects. Right, so we see a lot of failures over there. This also leads to the human capital breakdown. Right, so all the human resources start failing, people start working longer hours, their personal life suffers, and of course that has a detrimental effect on the company. Alright, so if we look at the contracting theory, what do we need to think about when we're going to jump into bed with somebody? If you go out to a bar and there's a nice lady around, or a nice somebody around at the bar, what are you going to do to make sure that you are covered? Right? Obviously you're going to take out the necessary protective action or protective gear, and this is typically what contracts are all about. So the earlier we sign the contract with less information available, the higher the risk is going to be. Right, so make sure that at the point where you're ready to sign the contract, you have the scope well defined, and that you know exactly what you're going to get into bed with, so to speak. So if we look at this graph, this is one of my favorites, the opportunity for influence graph. You'll see there in the beginning, and these are the phases of our project down at the bottom, and these are different for each of the companies that you're going to work with throughout your life. You'll see there's pre-feasibility, feasibility. So basically over here, this is where we start with our job. We don't necessarily have all the information yet, so it's not really a good point to sign the contract, because if there are mistakes, we might find that it's going to cost us later on. So what this graph is showing us is, early on, when the information is not well defined, the cost impact of changes are low. Alright, and this keeps on going as we progress through the different phases. However, the moment we start getting to execution phase, where we actually start constructing the components of our project, where we actually move on to site, we start doing work. If we do changes past that point, the cost in the red line becomes prohibitive. Right? So it's really expensive, because now we've already laid the pipe and we have to change it. And architects are many times the culprits for this, because they want to move stuff because it's not aesthetically pleasing for them. Alright, so there's a few things to think about when it comes to project execution. These are, as I say, one of my favorite slides. You'll see this one quite a few times. Alright, so the basic contracting rules, and many of you guys might have seen this already. It's basically whoever knows the rules the best is going to come out the winner of this project. And now many people will say it's not really a game, it's a win-win situation. But is there something like a win-win situation? Can all parties always win, or is somebody going to win a little bit less than somebody else? Alright, so that's another question that you can think about. Alright, so the contract is basically the rules of the game that we're going to play with. And the bidding process that we go through, this is now the tendering, getting the information, preparing our bid, all of that sets the climate for the execution of our project. Right, and of course, remember, everything needs to be written.